The silence of the Pacific Northwest isn't like the silence anywhere else in America. It's heavy, damp, and smells like rotting cedar and ancient secrets. I had moved to a small town outside of Seattle to escape the noise of my own life, renting a house that was too big for one person and too far from the nearest neighbor. It was a beautiful, mid-century modern place with floor-to-ceiling glass walls. At the time, I thought the view was a luxury. Now, I realize that glass walls are just a way for the darkness to look at you from every angle. The first week was peaceful, but by the 10th day, the rain started. It wasn't a storm, it was a constant, gray drizzle that blurred the line between the sky and the forest. That Tuesday, I was sitting in my living room, reading a book, when I felt that prickly sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I looked toward the glass wall that faced the deep woods. The reflection of my lamp made it hard to see outside, so I got up and pressed my face against the glass. There was nothing but the swaying shadows of the pines. But as I turned away, I noticed something on the rug. It was a small, wet footprint. A bare footprint. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I live alone. I don't walk around barefoot, and I certainly hadn't been outside in the rain. I checked the doors. Locked. I checked the windows. Latched. I tried to tell myself it was an old stain that had somehow reacted to the humidity, but the water was still glistening on the fibers of the carpet. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with a butcher knife, watching the shadows stretch across the floor until the sun finally cracked through the gray clouds. The next morning, I decided to go into town. I needed to see people, to feel like I was part of the real world again. I stopped at a local diner, the kind of place where the floor is sticky and the coffee tastes like burnt beans. An old man in a faded trucker hat was sitting at the counter, staring at me. When I sat down, he didn't look away. He leaned over and whispered, "You're in the Miller house, aren't you?" I nodded, confused. He just shook his head and said, "Keep your curtains closed, girl. Some things in these woods haven't figured out they're dead yet." I laughed it off as local superstition. People in small-town America love to scare the city folk. It's a pastime. But when I got back to the house, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, like I was walking through water. I went to my bedroom to change, and that's when I saw it. Hanging from the ceiling fan was a long, thin strand of black hair. I have blonde hair. This strand was nearly 3 feet long, damp, and smelled faintly of stagnant pond water. My stomach turned over. Someone, or something, had been in my room while I was getting coffee. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the screen was dead. Not just out of battery, but dead. The glass was cracked from the inside out, spiderwebbing from the center of the screen as if someone had pressed a thumb into it with impossible force. That was the moment the flight instinct kicked in. I grabbed my car keys and ran to the front door. I pulled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, it felt like it was welded shut. I threw my shoulder against it, screaming for help, even though I knew the nearest house was 2 miles away. I ran to the glass walls in the living room, intending to smash my way out with a chair. I picked up a heavy wooden stool and turned toward the glass, but I stopped dead. On the other side of the glass, less than an inch away from my face, was a woman. She was wearing a soaked, tattered white dress that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. Her skin was the color of a bruise, a sickly, mottled purple and gray. But it was her face that broke my mind. She didn't have eyes. Where her eyes should have been, there were just smooth patches of skin, like a doll that hadn't been finished. And she was smiling. Not a happy smile, but a wide, stretching grin that showed too many teeth. She tapped on the glass. Tink. 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 The sound wasn't coming from the outside. It was echoing from inside the house. Behind me. I spun around, and there she was again, standing at the end of the hallway. She was in 2 places at once. The one outside was still tapping, but the one inside started to walk. She didn't move like a human, her limbs jerked and snapped, her head tilting at angles that should have broken her neck. With every step she took, the lights in the house flickered and died, plunging the hallway into darkness. "I like your life," she whispered. The voice didn't come from her mouth. It came from the speakers of my television, which had turned itself onto a screen of pure white static. "I think I'll wear it for a while." I didn't think. I just reacted. I smashed the stool against the glass wall. It shattered into a million diamonds, and I lunged out into the mud and the rain. I didn't go for my car, I knew she'd be waiting there. I ran into the woods, the thorns tearing at my skin, the mud sucking at my shoes. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I eventually found a ranger station near the highway. They found me shivering, covered in blood and filth, babbling about a woman with no eyes. When the police went back to the house, they found it empty. No woman. No black hair. No broken phone. Even the glass wall I had smashed was perfectly intact, as if it had never been touched. The only thing they found was a single, bare footprint on the living room rug. It was wet. And it was exactly the same size as my own. I moved back to the city the next day. I live in a high-rise now, with no windows that open and no woods for miles. But sometimes, when it rains, I hear a faint tapping. Tink. Tink. And when I look in the mirror to brush my hair, for a split second, my reflection doesn't have eyes. It just smiles back at me with too many teeth, waiting for its turn to come back outside. The thing about the Midwest is the emptiness. People think the ocean is vast, but have you ever stood in the middle of a Kansas cornfield at midnight? The stalks are 10 feet tall, surrounding you like a million whispering ghosts, and the sky is so big it feels like it's trying to swallow the earth whole. My name is Elias, and 3 years ago, I took a shortcut through a town that isn't on any map. It was a mistake that cost me my sleep, my sanity, and very nearly, my soul. The hook for me was the heat. It was August, the kind of American summer where the air feels like wet wool. I was driving my old 2005 Chevy from Colorado to Chicago, trying to make it home for my sister's wedding. The interstate was jammed due to a massive semi-truck accident, so I did what every horror movie victim does. I trusted my GPS when it suggested an alternate route through the back roads of rural Nebraska. Within an hour, the paved road turned to gravel. Then the gravel turned to dirt. My GPS signal bars dropped to 0, and the little blue dot on my screen started spinning in circles. I was in a sea of corn. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in a bruised purple and a sickly, neon orange. That's when I saw the first one. It was a scarecrow. But it wasn't in the field. It was standing right on the edge of the dirt road. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, clothed in a filthy, oversized tuxedo that looked like it had been buried and dug back up. The head wasn't a pumpkin or a burlap sack, it was a steer's skull, bleached bone white, tied to the wooden post with rusted barbed wire. As I drove past it, I could have sworn the skull tilted. Just a fraction of an inch. Following my cart I shook it off. Local folk art, I muttered to myself, cranking up the radio. But the radio only put out static, thick, rhythmic static that sounded like someone breathing into a microphone. 10 miles later, I saw the second scarecrow. Then the third. Then the fourth. They were getting closer to the road each time. And they were changing. The tuxedo was gone, replaced by modern clothes. A flannel shirt that looked exactly like the one I was wearing. A pair of worn-out jeans. And the skulls were gone too. Now, the heads were made of tightly wound corn husks, shaped into the crude, featureless approximation of a human face. The sun went down completely. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Suddenly, the engine of my Chevy sputtered. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then, blackness. The car rolled to a silent stop in the middle of the road. The silence that followed was absolute. No crickets. No wind. Just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. I turned the key. Click. 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 The battery was dead. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I reached for my flashlight in the glove box. When I clicked it on and swept the beam across the road in front of me, my heart stopped. There were dozens of them. The road was lined with scarecrows now, hundreds of them, stretching back into the darkness. But they weren't on posts anymore. They were standing on their own 2 feet, leaning forward as if they were listening to my heartbeat. And the one directly in front of my hood was wearing my sister's wedding invitation, the one I had left on my dashboard, pinned to its chest with a rusted nail. I locked the doors. It was a useless gesture against the sheer number of them, but it made me feel human for a second longer. Then, the tapping started, tap. 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 It wasn't on the window. It was on the roof. Something heavy and dry was dragging itself across the top of my car. I looked up at the fabric ceiling of the Chevy and saw the indentation of a long, thin hand pressing down. The fingers were too long, with too many knuckles. "Go away," I whispered, my voice cracking. The response came from the radio. The static cleared for a single second, and a voice that sounded like dry leaves rubbing together, said, "You're late for the wedding, Elias." I lost it. I grabbed my tire iron from the back seat, unlocked the door, and bolted. I didn't stay on the road, I dived straight into the corn. It was a desperate move. In the corn, you can't see more than 2 feet in front of you. The leaves are sharp, they sliced at my face and arms like tiny razors. I ran blindly, guided only by the sound of something heavy crashing through the stalks behind me. It wasn't running. It was skittering. It sounded like a giant insect, or a man on all fours with wooden limbs. I burst into a small clearing in the middle of the field. In the center was an old, rotted farmhouse, its windows like empty eye sockets. I ran for the porch, my boots thudding on the wood, and threw myself inside, slamming the heavy oak door behind me. I pushed an old dresser in front of the door, gasping for air. The house smelled of dust and something sweet, like rotting peaches. I shone my light around. The walls were covered in Polaroid photos. Thousands of them. I stepped closer to look. They were all photos of people in cars. Families, couples, lone drivers. And in every photo, in the background, was a scarecrow. Closer in every shot. The last photo in the row was of me. It was taken 10 minutes ago, through my own windshield, while I was sitting in the dark. I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. Then another. "Elias?" It was my mother's voice. But my mother had passed away 5 years ago. I knew it wasn't her, but the sound of her voice was so perfect, so warm, that I found myself walking toward the stairs. "Elias, honey, come up here. I've saved a seat for you at the table." I reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the bedroom door. There was a table set for a feast. But the food was made of straw and dirt. And sitting in the chairs were the scarecrows. They weren't moving, but they were all facing the door. My mother's voice was coming from a small, hand-cranked phonograph on the bedside table. Behind the phonograph stood the tallest one yet. It was wearing my father's old suit. It didn't have a head. It held a needle and a thick roll of black thread in its wooden hands. "We need a face," the phonograph hissed. "Yours is so fresh." I didn't wait. I turned and jumped. Not down the stairs, I jumped straight through the second-story window. The glass shattered, and I hit the ground hard, rolling into the dirt. I didn't check for broken bones. I just ran. I ran until I hit the paved highway. I ran until a state trooper found me at 4 a.m., screaming at the moon. They found my car the next day. It was exactly where I left it, but it was stuffed, completely packed from floor to ceiling, with dried corn husks. My sister's wedding invitation was still on the dashboard, but my name had been neatly stitched out with black thread. I never made it to the wedding. I don't go to the Midwest anymore. And I never, ever drive at night. Because sometimes, when I'm in my apartment in a city, I look in the rearview mirror of my hallway, and I see a tall shadow wearing a tuxedo. It isn't moving. It's just waiting for me to take another shortcut. There is a specific kind of darkness that lives in the swamps of Louisiana. It's not just the absence of light, it's a living, breathing thing that smells of sulfur and stagnant water. People in the South tell you to stay out of the bayou after the sun sets, not because of the alligators or the cottonmouth snakes, but because the water has a memory. And sometimes, it decides to claim back what was once its own. My name is Marcus, and I'm a freelance photographer. I specialize in ruin porn, capturing the beauty of decaying buildings and forgotten history. Last spring, I heard rumors of a town called Aurelia. You won't find it on a GPS. It was a small logging community that was supposedly swallowed by the swamp during a massive flood in the 1920s. Legend has it the townspeople didn't leave, they just moved into the trees. I found a local guide, an old man named Gene who looked like he was made of leather and tobacco juice. He agreed to take me as far as the Dead Man's Curve in his airboat, but he wouldn't go a foot further. The water is high today, boy, Gene warned as I stepped onto the mossy bank with my camera gear. If you hear a bell ringing beneath the water, you don't look down. You just climb. You climb as high as you can and you don't come down until the sun touches the moss. I laughed, thinking it was just more Cajun folklore to scare the tourists. I had my heavy boots, my high-powered flashlight and a satellite phone. I felt invincible. That was my first mistake. The swamp was beautiful in a haunting way. Huge cypress trees rose out of the black water like the pillars of a sunken cathedral, draped in Spanish moss that looked like gray, rotting hair. As I waded deeper, the silence became deafening. There were no birds. No frogs. Just the wet slap of my boots in the mud. After 3 hours of trekking, I saw it. The spire of a church, tilting at a 45-degree angle, poking out of a cluster of lily pads. This was Aurelia. I spent the afternoon taking photos of the half-submerged houses. The wood was black and slimy, yet perfectly preserved by the peat. I climbed through the window of what looked like the old general store. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of silt, but I found something that sent a chill down my spine. On the back wall, there were dozens of handprints. Not small ones, but massive, elongated prints made of white clay. They were all pointing toward the floor. As I was adjusting my camera lens, the light shifted. The sun was setting, and the swamp was turning into a kaleidoscope of deep oranges and bloody reds. And then, I heard it. Clang. 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 It was a bell. But it didn't sound like it was in a tower. The sound was muffled, vibrating through the very ground I was standing on. It was coming from deep beneath the water. Remembering Gene's warning, I felt a sudden, irrational spike of fear. I started to head back, but the path I had taken was gone. The tide was coming in, not the ocean tide, but a sudden, violent surge of black water rising from the earth. Within minutes, the water was at my waist. I scrambled up the nearest cypress tree, dragging my heavy bag behind me. I climbed until I was 15 feet above the water, perched on a thick branch. From there, I looked down, and my breath caught in my throat. The water wasn't just rising, it was clearing. The silt was settling, and the black water became as transparent as glass. Beneath me, I could see the entire town of Aurelia illuminated by a strange, bioluminescent glow. And the people were there. Hundreds of them. They weren't skeletons. They looked like they were made of the swamp itself. Their skin was the texture of wet bark, their hair was long strands of moss. They were all standing in the streets of the sunken town, looking up. They didn't have eyes. Just empty, dark holes filled with water. One of them, a figure wearing the tattered remains of a priest's robe, began to float upward. He didn't swim, he rose like a bubble. He stopped just inches below the surface of the water, staring directly at me through the liquid lens. Clang. Clang. The priest opened his mouth, and instead of a voice, a stream of black bubbles escaped. But I heard the words in my head. The toll must be paid in skin. The trees are full, but the water is hungry. Suddenly, the tree I was leaning against began to shake. I looked up and saw that the Spanish moss was moving. It wasn't moss at all. They were long, spindly arms, thousands of them, reaching down from the canopy above. The trees were actually pillars of these creatures, stacked on top of one another, waiting for someone to climb into their trap. One of the moss arms wrapped around my ankle. The touch was ice cold and felt like wet paper. I screamed, kicking out with my other boot, but more arms descended. They weren't trying to kill me, they were trying to pull me up, further into the dark ceiling of the swamp. I reached into my bag and grabbed my emergency flare. I fumbled with the cap, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped it. The moss arms were now around my waist, lifting me off the branch. I felt my ribs groan under the pressure. I struck the flare. A blinding, magnesium-white light exploded in the darkness. The creatures hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and retreated from the heat. I fell back onto the branch, the flare shaking in my hand. In the white light, I saw the true face of the swamp. Every tree for miles was covered in these moss men, their eyeless faces twitching in the unaccustomed light. I didn't wait for the flare to burn out. I jumped. I hit the water hard, the coldness knocking the air out of my lungs. I didn't look down. I didn't look back. I swam toward where I thought the airboat was, my arms leaden and my heart screaming. Every time a piece of seaweed touched my leg, I shrieked, thinking it was a hand reaching up from the sunken church. I reached the dead man's curve just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. Gene was there, his engine idling. He didn't ask questions. He just grabbed the collar of my shirt and hauled me onto the metal deck. As we sped away, I looked back at the swamp. The water was back to its muddy, opaque self. The trees looked like normal trees again. But as I looked at my camera bag, I realized it was open. My high-end camera was gone. In its place was a single, heavy brass bell, encrusted with barnacles and smelling of 100 years of salt and death. I never went back to Louisiana. I sold my gear and moved to the desert, where the ground is hard and the water is scarce. But every time I take a shower, or every time I hear the sound of a distant bell, I freeze. Because I know that down there, in the Blackwater, there is a priest in a sunken church holding my camera, waiting for me to come back and finish the photo shoot. And sometimes, when I look at the photos on my phone, I find a new one that I didn't take. It's always the same shot, a blurry, underwater image of my own face, looking down from a tree, with the caption, "Next time, the toll is paid in full."